back to our series on World War One. As we enter 1918, the world finds itself on the precipice of change. The war has raged for over 3 years, reshaping empires and devastating nations. The United States has brought fresh energy to the Allied cause, while the Russian Revolution has removed a major player from the battlefield. The stage is now set for a dramatic and decisive year, marked by desperate offensives, groundbreaking tactics, and events that would forever alter the course of history. This is the story of the war's final chapter. On the 8th of January, President Woodrow Wilson issued his 14 points for peace and an end to the war. In April 1917, the United States entered World War I on the side of the Allies. Though possessing a massive pool of manpower and resources, the United States required time to mobilize its forces for war. As a result, Britain and France continued to bear the brunt of the fighting in 1917 as their forces took part in the failed Nivelle Offensive as well as the Battle of Passchendaele. With American forces preparing for combat, Wilson formed a study group in September 1917 to prepare materials for the peace negotiations following World War I. Wilson and his advisors recruited a team of 150 political and social scientists to research the root cause of the war in Europe. That group, known as the Inquiry, produced nearly 2,000 reports and 1,200 maps that were boiled down to 14 key recommendations to achieve a stable peace in Europe. In a speech before Congress on the 8th of January 1918, Wilson laid out his 14 points. One of Wilson's purposes in delivering the 14-point speech was to present a tactical alternative to the traditional notion of an international balance of power, preserved by alliances among nations, and to the Bolshevik-inspired dreams of world revolution that at the time were gaining ground both within and outside of Russia. Wilson hoped also to keep a conflict-ridden Russia in the war on the Allied side. This effort met with failure as the Bolsheviks sought peace with the Central Powers at the end of 1917, shortly after taking power following the Russian Revolution. In other ways, though, Wilson's 14 points played an essential role in world politics over the next several years. This piece was translated and distributed to the soldiers and citizens of Germany and Austria-Hungary, influencing their perspectives as the war drew to a close. Aware that submarine warfare had failed to defeat Britain and that large numbers of American troops would soon be committed to the war, the Germans prepared for their final offensive in the West. At the beginning of 1918, Germany's position on the battlefields of Europe looked terribly strong. German armies occupied virtually all of Belgium and much of northern France. With Romania, Russia, and Serbia out of the war by the end of 1917, conflict in the east was ending, leaving the Central Powers free to focus on combating the British and the French in the west. By the 21st of March 1918, Russia's exit had allowed Germany to shift no fewer than 44 divisions of men to the Western Front. These troops provided the Germans with numerical superiority over their adversaries. German commander Erich Ludendorff saw this as a crucial opportunity to launch a new offensive. He hoped to strike a decisive blow to the Allies and convince them to negotiate for peace before fresh troops from the United States could arrive. In November of 1917, he submitted his plan for the offensive that what would become known as the Kaiserschlacht, or the Kaiser's Battle, in English. The spring offensives were to consist of 4 major assaults codenamed Michael, Georgette, Butcher York, and Gneisenau. Apologies if I got that wrong. He planned to overpower the French and British with a series of offensives along the entire front. As German manpower was running short, it was imperative that the Kaiserschlacht succeeded as losses could not be effectively replaced. The first and largest of these offensives, Operation Michael, was intended to strike the British Expeditionary Force along the Somme with the goal of cutting it from the French to the south. The assault plan called for 4 German armies to break through the BEF lines, then wheel northwest to drive toward the English Channel. Leading the attack would be special stormtrooper units whose orders called for them to drive deep into British positions, bypassing strong points, with the goal of disrupting communications and reinforcements. Morale in the German army rose in reaction to the planned offensive. Many of the soldiers believed, along with their commanders, that the only way to go home was to push ahead. Field Marshal Haig's British divisions were all understrength in infantry. The government was unwilling to send more troops to the Western Front, so Haig was forced to reduce the number of infantry battalions in his divisions from 12 to 9. In mid-February 1918, 81 German divisions faced Haig's 59, and for the first time in 3 years, the British had to prepare to face a major attack. Haig could not afford to give ground near to the English coast, so the northern sector of his front was most heavily defended. Further south, his forces were more thinly spread. General Plummer's Second Army around Ypres had to hold 37 kilometers of line with 14 divisions, whereas south of Cambrai, General Gaux's Fifth Army only had 14 divisions with which to hold 67 kilometers. Michael began in the early morning hours of the 21st of March 1918, and they went in. The war of movement resumed. The assault shattered the British lines, and around 10,000 guns fired over 1 million shells in 5 hours against General Bly's 3rd and General Gaux's 5th armies. Then 47 German divisions attacked. The intense hurricane bombardments targeted artillery and machine gun positions, headquarters, telephone exchanges, railways, and communication centres. This undermined any chance of concerted British resistance. The attack also came as a relative surprise to the Allies, as the Germans had moved quietly into position just days before the bombardment began. From the beginning, it was more intense than anything yet seen on the Western Front. Ludendorff had worked with experts in artillery to create an innovative, lethal ground attack featuring a quick, intense artillery bombardment followed using various gases, first tear gas, then lethal, phosgene and chlorine gases. He also coordinated with the German air service of Luftstreitkräfte to maximize the force of the offensive. Winston Churchill, at the front at the time as the British Minister of Munitions, wrote of his experience on the 21st of March. There was a rumble of artillery fire, mostly distant, and the thudding explosions of airplane raids. And then, exactly as a pianist runs his hands across the keyboard from treble to bass, there rose in less than 1 minute the most tremendous cannonade I shall ever hear. It swept around us in a wide curve of red flame. Heavily armed German stormtroopers then infiltrated weak points in the line. They bypassed pockets of resistance and broke through the British trench system, leaving subsequent waves of troops to mop up any enemies to their rear. Lacking reserves, Gaux's line soon gave way. By the evening of the 23rd of March, the Germans had advanced up to 19 kilometers in some sectors. Lieutenant A.W. Bradbury wrote of his experience during this time. I stood up to see if I could find any sign of organized resistance and saw several men leaving their trench after being shelled and retiring, to be intercepted by military police and sent back at revolver point. MPs on the battlefield, it seemed incredible. MPs or military police were taking drastic measures to hold the line amidst the chaos. This sense of desperation reflected the early panic that spread along some sections of the Allied front. While the Germans prepared to be on the verge of a stunning victory, the early successes belied the core weaknesses of the plan. The Germans were too exhausted to sustain the offensive and lacked the transport to convert local tactic triumphs into strategic victory. They struggled to move men, supplies, and guns across the shattered landscape of the Western Front. But in the first few days, panic spread along some sections of the Allied front. It looked like the Germans might win. As the crisis developed, Sir Douglas Haig requested reinforcements from his French counterpart, General Philippe Pétain. This request was refused, as Pétain was concerned about protecting Paris. Angered, Haig was able to force an Allied conference on the 26th of March at Doullens. Pétain was widely admired, but the French government, Georges Clemenceau, considered Pétain too cautious, and thus the meeting resulted in the appointment of General Ferdinand Foch as the overall Allied commander. By early April, when Ludendorff called off the first stage of the offensive, German forces had advanced 64 kilometers. However, by the 5th of April, their advance began to lose momentum, and they were ultimately held east of Amiens. On the 7th of April, the Germans tried again with a smaller offensive south of Ypres. Operation Georgette captured the Messines Ridge and much of the Passchendaele salient. Once again, the German attack lost momentum. Although the Germans tested the French with a series of offensives further south between the 27th of May and the 15th of July, they had shot their bolt. German morale began to crumble. Before diving into the Second Battle of the Marne, let's take a moment to explore the role of planes during World War I. World War I was the first major conflict to harness the power of planes. Though not as impactful as the British Royal Navy or Germany's U-boats, the use of planes in World War I presaged their later pivotal role in military conflicts around the globe. At the dawn of World War I, aviation was a relatively new field. The Wright brothers took their first sustained flight just 11 years before, in 1903. Aircrafts were initially used primarily for reconnaissance missions. During the First Battle of the Marne, information passed from pilots allowed the Allies to exploit weak points in the German lines, helping the Allies to push Germany out of France. The first machine guns were successfully mounted on planes in June of 1912 in the United States, but were imperfect. If timed incorrectly, a bullet could easily destroy the propeller of the plane it came from. The Morane Saunier L, a French plane, provided a solution. The propeller was armoured with deflector wedges that prevented bullets from hitting it. The Morane Saunier Type L was used by the French, the British Royal Flying Corps, part of the army, the British Royal Navy Air Service, and the Imperial Russian Air Service. The British Bristol Type 22 was another popular model used for both reconnaissance work and as a fighter plane. Dutch inventor Anthony Fokker improved upon the French deflector system in 1915. His interrupter synchronized the firing of the guns with the plane's propeller to avoid collisions. Though his most popular plane during World War I was the single-seat Fokker Eindecker. Fokker created over 40 kinds of airplanes for the Germans. The Allies debuted the Handley Page HP 0400, the first two-engine bomber, in 1915. As aerial technology progressed, long-range heavy bombers like Germany's Gotha GV, first introduced in 1970, were used to strike cities like London. These planes are the world's first strategic bombers. Their speed and maneuverability proved to be far deadlier than Germany's earlier Zeppelin raids, solidifying the Gotha GV's role as a more effective aerial threat. Parisians were living in fear of the Gothas. Despite air raids and shelters, 200 Parisians were unalived by bombs from German airplanes. By the war's end, the Allies were producing 5 times more aircraft than the Germans. On the 1st of April 1918, the British created the Royal Air Force, or RAF, the first air force to be a separate military branch, independent from the Navy or Army. The rapid advancements in aerotechnology were matched by the growing fame of the individuals who piloted these machines. Fighter pilots were on every front page during 1918. Stories of their aircraft and exploits reassure those at home and earn them much admiration. A former automobile racer and Pershing's personal chauffeur, Eddie Rickenbacker, became an ace with 26 victories. He survived the awful dogfights in the sky, but the most famous French airman, Georges Guynemer, was shot down. Other flying aces make history, such as France's René Fonck with 75 victories and Canada's Billy Bishop. Their most feared adversary is the German ace Manfred von Richthofen, who amassed 80 victories. He is one of the rare pilots to comment on the real meaning of air combat victories. Richthofen says, quote, "The murder of a man is still a murder, even in wartime," end quote. His noble Prussian blood and the colour of his airplane earned him the nickname the Red Baron. He flew the three-winged fighter, the famous Fokker triplane, remarkable for its maneuverability and speed. The Red Baron's final flight took place on the 21st of April 1918 when pilots from his flying circus engaged a group of British planes over Vaux-sur-Somme, France. He developed a new tactic with the other pilots of his squadron. He described it, "With my bright red plane, I serve as bait. I fly very low. My pilots fly in weight above, ready to dive on any plane that goes for me. As Richthofen swooped low in pursuit of an enemy fighter, he came under attack from Australian machine gunners on the ground and a plane piloted by Canadian ace Arthur Roy Brown. During the exchange of fire, Richthofen was struck in the torso by a bullet and died after crash landing in the field. Brown got official credit for the victory, but debate continues over whether he or the Australian infantryman fired the fatal shot. Following Manfred von Richthofen's death, Allied troops recovered his body and buried him with full military honours. The 25-year-old had only prowled the skies for a little over 2 years, but his 80 confirmed aerial victories proved to be the most of any pilot on either side of World War I. As battles raged in the skies, the ground war continued with unrelenting intensity. Following the successes of his 4 major offensives in France from March to June 1918, Ludendorff conceived another offensive as a diversion to draw French troops away from the Flanders front, against which he planned to direct his final decisive offensive. In the diversionary attack, he intended to capture Reims and split the French armies. On the morning of the 15th of July, 23 divisions of the German 1st and 3rd Armies attacked the French 4th Army east of Reims, while 17 divisions of the 7th Army, assisted by the 9th Army, attacked the French 6th Army to the west of the city. The French General Ferdinand Foch had foreseen the coming offensive, and the Germans consequently met unexpected French resistance and counterattacks. When the Germans began their advance after an initial artillery bombardment, they found that the French had set up a line of false trenches, manned by only a few defenders. The real front line of trenches lay further on and had scarcely been touched by the bombardment. This deceptive strategy had been put in place by the French commander-in-chief, Philippe Pétain. As a German officer, Rudolf Binding wrote in his diary of the 15th of July attack, "The French put up no resistance in the front. They had neither infantry nor artillery in this forward battle zone. Our guns bombarded empty trenches. Our gas shells gassed empty artillery positions. The barrage, which was to have preceded and protected the attacking German troops, went right on somewhere over the enemy's rear positions, while in the front, the first real line of resistance was not yet carried. As the Germans approached the real Allied front lines, they were met with a fierce barrage of French and American fire. German troops did cross the Marne River at several points, but were able to advance only a few miles. British, American and Italian units assisted the French in their defence. In the southwest, the Germans advanced only 6 miles, under heavy fire before bogging down. Trapped and surrounded, the Germans suffered heavy casualties, setting the Allies up for the major counterattack they would launch on the 18th of July. Allied troops attacked the Germans' large Marne salient, taking the Germans by surprise. 3 days later, the Allies crossed the Marne, and the Germans retreated to their former and vessel lines, the lines they occupied at the beginning of the spring offensive. Attacking these positions on the 6th of August, Allied troops were repulsed by a stubborn German defence. The salient retaken, the Allies dug in to consolidate their gains and prepare for further offensive action. The counter-offensive was decisive in shifting the balance of power in the West against an increasingly exhausted German army. The spring offensive was tactically flawed. The spring offensive gained significant ground, but at a significant cost. The forward wave of stormtroopers moved more quickly than their supply lines and constantly found themselves short of food, ammunition, and reinforcements. The use of Germany's best troops in an advanced capacity meant they also suffered a higher rate of casualties, while the quality of rear defensive positions was weakened. Germany had lost almost 1 million men in a 6-month period. The Allies also suffered heavy casualties, although their losses were generally lower than Germany's. To improve morale, Kaiser Wilhelm handed out the Iron Cross to his soldiers, but he was visibly worried. His men have still not broken the enemy lines. Germany's attempt to break through had exhausted its army, and the initiative passed back to the Allies. On the 8th of August, General Rawlinson's 4th Army launched a major attack at Amiens against the vulnerable salient created by the German offensive. Allied commanders had hoped to launch a limited offensive to secure a series of strategic transit hubs. As part of this, Foch planned an attack in the Amiens region of northern France that would protect the vital Paris-Amiens railway. The attacking force comprised the Canadian Corps, the British Fourth Army, the French First Army, the Australian Corps, and others. In early August, the Allies made a show of weakening their front line so that German officers expected no assault. In reality, troops were being moved to the front at night, while bogus radio communication reinforced the deception. The Allied offensive would be supported by thousands of heavy and super heavy field guns, more than 600 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft. The Germans were greatly outnumbered and, in the words of German military chief Erich Ludendorff, depressed down to hell. The Germans were protected by 3 lines of trenches, which were poorly wired for communications and without good dugout shelters. Unlike earlier offensives, the Amiens assault would not be preceded by bombardment to preserve the element of surprise. A Royal Air Force squadron laid smoke screens over the battlefield, and a heavy mist concealed no man's land as the attack grew nearer. On the 8th of August at exactly 4:20 a.m., 900 Allied guns opened fire and the infantry headed towards the German lines. The Germans were entirely unprepared for an attack of this scale, and many surrendered at the first chance. Allied soldiers fought through woods to clear German machine gun positions and take prisoners. The tanks lagged, struggling across the boggy terrain. The battle ended on the 11th of August as German resistance stiffened, and Canadian Commander Sir Arthur Currie urged the Allied leadership to consolidate the gains they had made thus far. This time it was the German front that broke. By the end of the advance, a gap of 24 kilometers had been punched in the German line, south of the Somme. In 3 days, the Allies had advanced some 8 miles, a huge achievement in a war characterized by minute gains at enormous cost. More than 19,000 Allied soldiers were killed or injured, while the Germans lost more than 26,000, including some 12,000 prisoners. Also captured by the Allies was the Amiens gun, a 280mm 11-inch Krupp naval gun that had been mounted on a railway carriage. The Amiens gun had been shelling the city of Amiens throughout the summer, and previous attempts to disable it had been unsuccessful. But an enterprising Australian sapper commandeered the train's engine and drove it back to the Allies. The Battle of Amiens illustrated that the British had learned how to combine infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft in a coordinated all-arms attack. It was the first time that such large-scale capitulations had occurred. Around 30,000 German soldiers surrendered during the Battle of Amiens. General Ludendorff described the first day of this battle as the Black Day of the German army, due to the collapse in morale. Everything I had feared, and of which I had so often given warning, had here in one place become a reality. When Ludendorff informed German Emperor Wilhelm II of the disaster at Amiens 2 days later, Wilhelm replied, quote, "We have reached the limits of our capacity. The war must be terminated," end quote. Indeed, Amiens sparked the 100 Days campaign, the successful Allied push that would drive the Germans backwards. With the momentum from the Allied successes, the stage was set for further offensives. By the end of August, there were over 1.4 million American troops in France. It was the arrival of these fresh troops that enabled the Allies to continue fighting after their significant losses during the German spring offensive. The attack on the St. Mihiel salient was the first and only American-led attack during the First World War. The Allied attack against the St. Mihiel salient provided the Americans with an opportunity to use the American expeditionary forces in the Western Front en masse and, for the first time, under their own command rather than under that of French generals. Although lacking some of the tactical skills of the French and British, the United States First Army carried the day through sheer determination, overwhelming numbers, and its multifaceted plan of attack. The battle was also noteworthy as the first major use in the war of the U.S. Army Air Service, precursor to the U.S. Air Force, led by William Billy Mitchell, and the aggressive tank assaults by George Patton, who boldly led his charges from the front lines and not from the rear as many other officers did during the war. Pershing had, in the main, fought off attempts to use his divisions piecemeal in support of French and British operations, preferring to hold them back to form a separate US Army. Pershing said his troops won't be available before 1919. Exasperated, Foch asked him if he intends to sit out until the French and British have been defeated. Pershing did not want to sacrifice his men in trench warfare. He was preparing for another type of combat, open warfare, a war of movement over vast areas and in the sky. The attack on the St. Mihiel salient, a bulge in the old Verdun line that extended outward toward the Allied lines and that was 25 miles long and 50 miles deep, gave them the opportunity to use the US First Army in combat for the first time. In a plan developed by a rising young Lieutenant Colonel, George Catlett Marshall, the American part of the assault was to be conducted by 2 supercorps, each with 3 divisions in attack and 1 in reserve, marking the largest assembly of United States soldiers since the American Civil War. 2 smaller French corps would provide support on the western part of the salient. Ludendorff, now short of men and aware of the coming Allied offensive, had decided to withdraw from the salient to a shorter and more easily defended line to the rear. As the Germans were withdrawing, the Allies attacked on the 12th of September. With much of their artillery not in place, the Germans were poorly prepared to maintain the front line, an advantage that the attacking Americans were quick to exploit. The American assault was aided by coordinated strafing and bombing runs. Mitchell had assembled the largest air armada of World War I, numbering more than 1,000 airplanes, and these set about relentlessly bombing German positions and reshaping the battlefront to limit avenues of escape. German fighter races dueled in the sky with the likes of budding American aces Eddie Rickenbacker and Frank Luke. So successful was Mitchell's air campaign that he was promoted to brigadier general after the battle. The relative ease of the initial American attack came as a surprise to Pershing, and he sent orders to his commanders to speed up their advance. By the 13th of September, lead units of the US First Army had met up with Allied troops advancing from the west. 3 days later, the offensive was halted, with the salient in Allied hands. The United States suffered 7,000 casualties, German at least 17,000, including 10,000 captured. The Battle of St. Mihiel easily convinced the British and French military leadership that the Americans were capable of operating on their own on the battlefield. Pershing now dispatched his forces westward to take part in the forthcoming Meuse-Argonne offensive. At 5:30 on the morning of the 26th of September 1918, after a 6-hour-long bombardment over the previous night, more than 700 Allied tanks, followed closely by infantry troops, advanced against the German positions in the Argonne forest and along the Meuse River. Building on the successes of earlier Allied offensive at Amiens, the Meuse-Argonne offensive carried out by 37 French and American divisions was even more ambitious. Aiming to cut off the entire German Second Army, Foch ordered General John J. Pershing to take overall command of the offensive. Pershing's American Expeditionary Force was to play the main attacking role in what would be the largest American run offensive of World War I. After some 400,000 US troops were transferred with difficulty to the region in the wake of the US run attack at St. Mihiel, the Meuse-Argonne offensive began on the 26th of September 1918. The preliminary bombardment using some 800 mustard gas and Phosphine shells killed 278 German soldiers and incapacitated more than 10,000. The infantry advance began the next morning, supported by a battery of tanks and some 500 aircraft from the US Air Service. It was later reported that more ammunition was expended during the bombardment than had been used in the entirety of the Civil War. On the 26th of September, the British broke through the Hindenburg Line. Built in late 1916, the Hindenburg Line, named by the British for the German Commander-in-Chief Paul von Hindenburg, it was known to the Germans as the Siegfried Line, formed the main German defences. It was a heavily fortified zone running several miles behind the active front between the north coast of France and Verdun, near the border of France and Belgium. By September 1918, the formidable system consisted of 6 defensive lines, forming a zone some 600 yards deep, ribbed with lengths of barbed wire and dotted with concrete emplacements or firing positions. Though the entire line was heavily fortified, its southern part was most vulnerable to attack, as it included the St. Quentin Canal and was not out of sight from artillery observation by the enemy. Also, the whole system was laid out linearly as opposed to newer construction that had adapted to more recent developments in firepower and were built with scattered strong points laid out like a checkerboard to enhance the intensity of artillery fire. The Allies would use these vulnerabilities to their advantage, concentrating all the force against the Hindenburg Line in late September. By the morning of the following day, the Allies had captured more than 23,000 German prisoners. By nightfall, they had taken 10,000 more and advanced up to 6 miles in some areas. The Germans continued to fight, however, putting up a stiff resistance that ultimately forced the Allies to settle for far fewer gains than they had hoped. The Battle of St. Quentin Canal was a crucial victory that broke through one of the strongest sections of the Hindenburg Line and successfully crossing the St. Quentin Canal. Pershing called off the Meuse-Argonne offensive on the 30th of September. It was renewed again just 4 days later on the 4th of October. By the 31st of October, the American forces had advanced 10 miles, the French had advanced 20 miles, and the Argonne had been cleared of German troops. More than 1 million Americans participated in the battles, but the American Expeditionary Force's casualties were heavy, and its largely inexperienced formations were becoming increasingly disorganized. Throughout the 100 Days offensive, poor morale in the German army contributed significantly to the Allied victories. The failure of the spring offensive and the surprise counterattack at Amiens demoralized the German troops. Many Germans surrender when their final effort to hold the line fails. Following the complete breakthrough of the Hindenburg Line in early October, General Ludendorff is reported to have said that the situation of the German army demands an immediate armistice in order to save a catastrophe. General Sir Henry Rawlinson remarked that the Hindenburg Line would have been impregnable if it had been defended by the German army 2 years earlier. However, the opportunity for such defense had long passed. It was clear that Germany could no longer win the war. Despite a string of defeats, German leaders were still trying to convince the soldiers that defeat was impossible. Ludendorff spoke of armistice in private. In public, though, he defended the army's record. On the 25th of October 1918, Ludendorff issued a proclamation. For us, as soldiers, capitulation is unacceptable. We must resist with all our might. But many are too young for battle or too old. Most feel only relief. There's no need for propaganda now. Camera crews go back to film the revolution. On the 28th of October 1918, sailors in the German High Seas Fleet refused to obey an order from the German Admiralty to go to sea to launch one final attack on the British Navy. The defiance echoes the despondent mood of many on the side of the Central Powers during the last days of World War I. By the last week of October 1918, 3 of the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, were at least in talks with the Allies about reaching an armistice, while the 4th, Bulgaria, had already concluded one at the end of September. With the end of the war seemingly in sight, the German Naval Command, led by Reinhard Scheer, decided to launch a last-ditch effort against the British in the North Sea. 2 German destroyer groups would break from the harbour and attack the French and British coastline, enticing Allied ships to respond. Once in the open, they would be engaged by German U-boats and the rest of the Kaiser's fleet. In the words of Scheer, an honourable battle by the fleet, even if it should be a fight to the death, will sow the seed of a new German fleet for the future. There can be no future for a fleet fettered by dishonourable peace. Choosing not to inform the Chancellor Max von Baden of its plans, the German Admiralty issued the order to leave port on the 28th of October. Though the order was given 5 times, each time they resisted. Operation Plan 18, as it was called, was little more than a suicide mission. The German Navy, for all its ingenuity and U-boat strength, was hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned by the Allied fleet, which included British Commonwealth, French and American ships. German officers seemed to acknowledge, accept, and even relish this fact. On receiving their orders, some were observed drinking joyful toasts to the imminent battle and the, quote, death of the Kaiserliche Marine, end quote. Enlisted men responded much differently. few were interested in sacrificing their lives in the freezing waters of the North Sea in order that the Admiralty might restore some of its lost prestige. On the 29th of October, sailors aboard two major ships at the Kiel failed to return from shore leave. Within a few hours, the revolt had spread to several battleships and cruisers. In total, 1,000 mutinees were arrested, leaving the Imperial fleet immobilized. The growing mutiny forced the Admiralty to abandon Operation Plan 19. Instead, they attempted to divide and disperse the mutineers by relocating the troubled ships to other German ports. Within 48 hours, the mutiny had spread to other ports and naval stations. On the 3rd of November, the sailors at Kiel, joined by workers from the nearby city, detained their officers and took control of their ships. They also informed elected councils, not dissimilar to the workers of Soviets that had precipitated the Russian Revolution the previous year. Echoing the 14-point peace plan of the United States President Woodrow Wilson, the Kiel mutineers drafted their list of demands. The first 6 points being the release of all inmates and political prisoners, complete freedom of speech and the press, the abolition of male censorship, appropriate treatment of crews by superiors, no punishment for comrades returning to ships and barracks, no launching of the fleet under any circumstances. As the days passed, the Kiel mutiny spread across Germany and adopted a distinctly political tone. What had begun as a revolt against orders had transformed into a fully fledged political revolution. Workers' councils in Hamburg, Bremen, Lubeck, Munich, and other cities demanded political reforms, the abdication of the Kaiser and of local princes, the end of aristocratic privilege, the empowerment of the Reichstag, parliament, and the implementation of socialist policies. On the 7th of November, the Bavarian king Ludwig III fled to Austria in fear of his life. He later surrendered his power to a republican government. But Ludwig would not be the last nor the most significant German ruler to be dethroned. 2 days later, the Kaiser himself was forced from power, beginning Germany's transition to a republican government. Seeking safety, the Kaiser fled to the Netherlands, bringing an end to the Hohenzollern monarchy. While Germany's monarchy crumbled at home, the war still raged on the battlefield. The Allies relentlessly pursued the retreating German forces. With the United States pouring fresh troops into combat, the Germans were hopelessly outmatched and, under relentless pressure, forced to sue for peace. In the autumn of 1918, Germany and its allies were exhausted. The Central Powers were in disarray on the battlefield as well as the home front. Their armies were defeated and their hungry citizens were beginning to rebel. As early as the 29th of September, Ludendorff decided that a cessation of hostilities must be sought. In the last week of October 1918, Germany and Austria-Hungary were in talks with the Allies about reaching an armistice. Bulgaria had already concluded one at the end of September, so did the Ottoman Empire in late October. As Germany's allies crumbled around them, the war's outcome seemed clear. In an effort to facilitate armistice negotiations, Kaiser Wilhelm II named Prince Max von Baden, a minor royal of liberal political views, as Chancellor in October 1918. This appointment, it was hoped, would facilitate armistice negotiations with the Allies, preferably with the Americans, who were viewed as being more reasonable. The day after his appointment, von Baden contacted US President Woodrow Wilson with peace overtures. Wilson was at first prepared to broker a ceasefire, until when London and Paris became aware of his actions, they intervened. On the 23rd of October, von Baden was told that no armistice would be possible without an unconditional German surrender. But as von Baden was working to negotiate a ceasefire, German U-boats were continuing their aggression against Allied mercantile shipping. 3 Allied vessels were attacked in October 1918, a factor in the Allied refusal to accept any terms other than total surrender. Ludendorff refused to accept the armistice terms demanded by the Allies and insisted the war continue. He resigned when he was overruled and fled to Sweden. The Germans finally sent a late-night radio message to Marshal Ferdinand Foch, requesting permission to send a delegation through the lines to negotiate an armistice and ask for a general ceasefire. 45 minutes later, Foch replied. He ignored the ceasefire request, but gave the Germans permission to come. At 8 p.m. on the 7th of November, 3 automobiles carefully made their way through the nightmarish landscape of artillery craters and barbed wire in no man's land in northern France as a German bugler sounded a truce and another soldier waved a white flag. The German envoy switched to a French car and then boarded a train and travelled through the night. On the morning of the 8th of November, they pulled into a railroad siding in the forest of Compiègne in the region of Picardy, France, alongside Foch's railroad car. That was where the meeting would take place. The task that awaited the German diplomats weighed heavily upon them. There was the fear of national disgrace. Whoever proposed the laying down of arms would be hated by militaristic Germans for the rest of his life. There wasn't much of a negotiation. When the Germans asked if he had an Allied offer, Foch responded, quote, "I have no proposals to make." His instructions from the Allied governments were to simply present an as-is deal. French General Maxime Weygand then read the terms that the Allies had decided upon to the Germans. According to Lowry's account, the Germans became distraught when they heard that they would have to disarm, fearing that they'd be unable to defend their teetering government against communist revolutionaries. In the early morning hours of the 11th of November, Erzberger and Foch met for the final negotiations. According to Lowry, the German emissary tried his best to persuade Foch to make the agreement less severe. Foch made a few small changes, including letting the Germans keep a few of their weapons. Finally, just before dawn, the agreement was signed. The Germans agreed to pull their troops out of France, Belgium, and Luxembourg within 15 days, or risk becoming prisoners of the Allies. They had to turn over their arsenal, including 5,000 artillery pieces, 25,000 machine guns, 1,700 airplanes, along with 5,000 railroad locomotives, 5,000 trucks, and 150,000 wagons. Germany also had to give up the contested territory of Alsace and Lorraine, and they agreed to the indignity of Allied forces occupying German territory along the Rhineland, where they would stay until 1930. The Allies wanted to ensure that the Germans could not resume the war if the long-term peace negotiations broke down. The armistice was signed at 5:45 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918 in a railroad carriage at Compiègne. The agreement took effect on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, officially ending the war on the Western Front. Lance Corporal Frederick Ledge later recalled the events of that day. Entering a village as we followed behind the brigade, our drum struck up the Marseillaise. The populace became wildly excited, not having heard their national anthem for a long time. An old man wearing an old-fashioned nightcap opened the window and leant so far forward, cheering and waving his arms, that one feared he might topple out. The incessant boom of artillery abruptly went silent along the Western Front in France. An American medical officer, Stanhope Bain-Jones, suddenly could hear water dripping off a bush next to him. It seemed mysterious, queer, unbelievable, he later recalled. All the men knew what the silence meant, but nobody shouted or threw his hat in the air. It took hours for the reality to sink in. Fighting on the Western Front persisted up to the final moments before the armistice were declared. When the armistice was announced, the British were back at Mons. This is significant because Mons had been the location of the first battle fought by the British Army in August 1914 and had been occupied by the Germans for the duration of the war. Initially, the Allies had not expected the offensive to end the war, but were planning their final attack for the spring of 1919. However, their impressive feat of arms during the 100 Days broke the spirit of the German army and inflicted losses from which they could not recover. The 100 Days offensive brought victory, but at a huge cost. Allied casualties between August and November 1918 were around 700,000. German casualties were slightly higher, around 760,000. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was the deadliest battle in American history, with over 26,000 killed. 1918 was the costliest year of warfare on the Western Front. With the war now over, the business of shaping the peace began. A peace conference was held in Paris between January 1919 and January 1920, at which separate treaties were drawn up with each of the defeated nations. As with the armistice, it was the victorious allies who decided the terms and conditions to be imposed. The most significant treaty was the one with Germany. When the German leaders signed the armistice, they believed Wilson's vision would form the basis for any future peace treaty. This would not prove to be the case. The Paris Conference opened on the 18th of January 1919, a date that was significant in that it marked the anniversary of the coronation of German Emperor Wilhelm I, which took place in the Palace of Versailles at the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. Prussian victory in that conflict had resulted in Germany's unification and its seizure of Alsace-Lorraine provinces from France. In 1919, France and its Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, had not forgotten the humiliating loss and intended to avenge it in the new peace agreement. The conference was dominated by the national leaders known as the Big Four: David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom; Georges Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France; Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States; and Vittorio Orlando, the Prime Minister of Italy. The first three made key decisions. The demonstrated independence and effectiveness of American forces on the battlefield, particularly in the battles like Saint Mihiel and Meuse-Argonne, strengthened their position at the negotiation table, giving them a critical role in discussions over Germany's surrender and the subsequent peace settlement. Germany and the other defeated powers, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey, were not presented at the Paris Peace Conference. Also absent was Russia. The country's new Bolshevik government concluded a separate peace with Germany and withdrew from the conflict. The Big Four had competing objectives in Paris. Clemenceau's main goal was to protect France from yet another attack by Germany. He sought heavy reparations from Germany as a way of limiting German economic recovery after the war and minimizing this possibility. Lloyd George, on the other hand, saw the rebuilding of Germany as a priority to re-establish the nation as a strong trading partner for Great Britain. George was wary of punishing Germany too severely, but he was aware the British people wanted Germany to be made to pay for the war. For his part, Orlando wanted to expand Italy's influence and shape it into a major power that could hold its own alongside the other great nations. Wilson opposed Italian territorial demands, as well as previously existing arrangements regarding territory between the other allies. Instead, he wanted to create a new world order along the lines of his 14 points. The other leaders saw Wilson as too naive and idealistic, and his principles were difficult to translate into policy. Nevertheless, the treaty included the Covenant of the League of Nations, in which members guaranteed each other's independence and territorial integrity. Wilson had been convinced that no lasting peace would be possible unless an international organization came into existence. He chaired the commission that drew up the Covenant, a short and concise document of 26 articles that was unanimously adopted at the conference on the 28th of April 1919. Under its terms, economic sanctions would be applied against any member who resorted to war. The League was to supervise mandated territories, the occupied Saar Basin, an important German coalfield, and Danzig, a major port in East Prussia, and to formulate plans for reducing armaments. The treaty also established the Permanent Court of International Justice and the International Labour Organization. In the end, the European allies imposed harsh peace terms on Germany. They demanded compensation by Germany for all damage done to the civilian population of the Allies and their property by the aggression of Germany by land, by sea, and from the air. The Big Four, especially Clemenceau, wanted to make sure that Germany would never again pose a military threat to the rest of Europe, and the treaty contained several stipulations to guarantee this aim. Germany was forced to surrender around 10% of its territory. In the west, Alsace and Lorraine were returned to France, all its overseas empire taken over by the Allies and divided among themselves. Other key provisions of the Treaty of Versailles called for the demilitarization and occupation of the Rhineland, to give France, Belgium, and the Netherlands security against any future German attack, and serve as a guarantee for Germany's reparations obligations. Reduced the army to 100,000 men. The general staff was eliminated. the German Navy and Air Force appropriated by the Allies, the manufacture of armoured cars, tanks, ships, submarines, airplanes, and poison gas was forbidden, and only a small number of specified factories could make weapons or munitions. The terms of the Treaty of Versailles that the Germans most resented, however, were the so-called honour clauses. Articles 227 through 230 gave the Allies the right to try individual Germans, including the former Emperor, Wilhelm II, as war criminals. Article 231, often called the War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept full responsibility for starting World War I and provided the justification for Article 232, which established a commission to collect reparation payments for Allied war losses and damage. It was impossible to compute the exact sum to be paid as reparations for the damage caused by the Germans, especially in France and Belgium. At the time the treaty was being drafted, but a commission that assessed the losses incurred by the civilian population set an amount of 132 billion gold marks, their currency before the euro, in 1921. About 6.096 billion pounds or 33 billion US dollars in 1919. More than 500 billion today. They became poor because of this. Germany would also be subject to invasion if it fell behind on payments. What are your thoughts so far on the treaty? Do you think Germany should be held accountable for all these losses and damage? Reaching a general consensus was difficult because the Allied powers who dominated the conference all had different agendas. Further, the 9 points covering new territorial consignments were complicated by the secret treaties that England, France, and Italy had made with Greece, Romania, and each other during the last years of the war. The Italian government struggled against great opposition from the other Allied leaders to see that they were given all they had been promised in the Treaty of London. At one point in the negotiations, the entire Italian delegation walked out of the peace conference, returning only days later. The other Allied leaders were hesitant or unwilling to fulfill the Treaty of London promises to Italy because they conflicted with other priorities, such as Wilson's division for self-determination and post-war borders. It wasn't until May that the Allies managed to agree a common position among themselves that they could present to the Germans. The final version of the Treaty of Versailles was presented to a German delegation on the 7th of May 1919. Upon learning of the full terms of the treaty, the German provisional government in Weimar was thrown into upheaval. What hand would not wither that binds itself and us in these fetters? Philip Scheidemann asked, new Chancellor of Germany, and he resigned rather than accept the treaty. Army Chief Paul von Hindenburg did the same, after declaring the army unable to resume the war under any circumstances. It took an ultimatum in the form of a food blockade from the Allies to bring the German delegation to Paris to sign the treaty on the 28th of June, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The treaties of Saint-Germain and Neuilly provided the Allied terms for peace with Austria-Hungary and Bulgaria, respectively. King George V, his Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and Marshal Foch embraced their role as victors, but divisions emerged among them. For the British, the priority was to prevent the return of war, while the French believed Germany must be punished. Marshal Foch refused to attend the signing ceremony, believing the treaty failed to adequately secure against the future German threat. Meanwhile, the United States Congress declined to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, opting instead to conclude separate peace treaties with Germany, Austria, and Hungary in 1921. The treaty was poorly received by Americans, who were largely opposed to joining the League of Nations. Ironically, the League's effectiveness was severely undermined when the United States Senate voted in March 1920 against American participation, despite President Wilson's tireless efforts to rally support. Many senators argued that joining the League would infringe on the United States' sovereignty and limit Congress's authority to declare war. Others feared it would entangle in the United States in costly commitments and reduce its ability to act independently in defense of its own interest. In the United States, the process of passing a bill through Congress, specifically through the Senate and the House of Representatives, is part of the system of checks and balances designed by the United States Constitution. This system ensures that no single branch of government, executive, legislative, or judicial, can have unchecked power, and it helps prevent the abuse of power. The United States never joined the League, and most historians agree that its absence significantly reduced the League's effectiveness. Though Italy would eventually receive control of the Tyrol and a permanent seat on the League of Nations, many within the country were dissatisfied with their lot and continued to nurse resentments of the other Allied powers. Resentments that would later drive the success of Benito Mussolini and his fascist movement. Fortunately for the Russian regime, the treaty they signed with Germany was abrogated, saving Russia from some of the worst consequences, though Poland and the Baltic states and Finland were not recovered in the peace settlement at Versailles. Germany, saddled with guilt, heavy reparations, and denied entrance into the League of Nations, Germany felt tricked into signing the treaty, having believed any peace would be a peace without victory, as put forward by President Wilson in his famous 14-point speech in January 1918. The German delegates were presented with a fait accompli. They were shocked at the severity of the terms and protested the contradictions between the assurances made when the armistice was negotiated and the actual treaty. They viewed the treaty as a diktat and felt that the treaty demanded intolerable sacrifices that would wreck their economy. Supporters of Versailles, however, liked to look at the peace treaty Germany imposed in Soviet Russia, which took vast areas of land, population, and wealth, and point out that country was no less keen to grab things. Whether one wrong justifies another is, of course, down to your perspective. After World War I, German military leaders tried shifting the blame for the country's defeat. During the war, they had kept the truth about the collapsing military situation from the population. Further, many Germans did not want to believe that the German military had been defeated. A myth soon began to spread that German forces could have won if they had not been, quote, stabbed in the back, end quote, by disloyal German citizens who had undermined the war effort. German military leaders helped spread this false idea. Among them were Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg. On the 18th of November 1919, a parliamentary committee of inquiry interrogated the commander-in-chief of the German army, General Paul von Hindenburg, on the reasons why Germany had lost the First World War. According to von Hindenburg, Germany had lost because the new government had not supported him and had started peace negotiations. Moreover, the German army had been weakened by the revolutionary atmosphere in the army and in at home. He quoted an English general who had allegedly said, "The German army has been stabbed in the back." According to this conspiracy theory, the German army had not been defeated on the battlefield, but because social democratic politicians had signed the truce to take control. The army command had made mistakes, and the German army was in no shape to keep on fighting. But generals like Hindenburg and Ludendorff spread this narrative to perhaps avoid having to admit the mistakes they had made. Many Germans accepted the idea that this made the Weimar Republic and the Treaty of Versailles illegitimate. Several of the politicians who signed the treaty were leaders of the Weimar government. Their opponents began to call them the November criminals and accused them of betraying the German army and people. The myth of the stab in the back became a powerful tool for targeting socialists, communists, and Jewish people for supposedly undermining the German military. Right-wing extremist, nationalist, and anti-Semitic groups believed that this stab in the back was the work of an international Jewish conspiracy. Even during the war, fabrications were circulating about the supposed lack of patriotism among the German Jews. For that reason, the German government introduced a Judenslang, apologies if I got that wrong, count of Jews, that is, in the army in 1916. It proved that the number of Jews fighting at the front was proportionate. The results of the investigation were not made public, though. Slanderous propaganda, such as the stab in the back myth, contributed to anti-Semitism and hatred of the social democratic government. In 1921, members of the Freikorps murdered politician Matthias Esberger, who signed the armistice in 1918. The Freikorps were paramilitary units composed mostly of former soldiers, including many from the German army that formed after World War I. These groups were often made up of right-wing, nationalist and anti-communist individuals who opposed the new Weimar Republic and its democratic government. Several Jewish and social democratic politicians were to fall victim to right-wing extremist assassinations in the years that followed. The war ended with an armistice, an agreement in which both sides agreed to stop fighting rather than surrender. For both sides, an armistice was the fastest way to end the war's misery and carnage. World War I took the lives of more than 9 million soldiers. 21 million more were wounded. Civilian casualties numbered close to 10 million. The two nations most affected were Germany and France, each of which sent some 80% of their male populations between the ages of 15 and 49 into battle. On a global scale, World War I led to the rise of the United States as a world power while precipitating the collapse of the German, Russian, Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. Of the great empires, only the British Empire survived. The map of Europe was dramatically redrawn. Germany was divided into two by the Polish corridor, intended to give Poland access to the sea. Austro-Hungary dissolved, with its territories divided among Italy and several newly created nations such as Yugoslavia. In late 1917, civil war broke out in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution. The civil war ended in 1923 with Lenin's Red Army claiming victory. Russia was renamed the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. You might sometimes hear it called the Soviet Union. New nation-states were created in Europe and the Middle East, but this often had the unwelcome consequence of sowing the seeds for future conflicts. The League of Nations, founded at the end of the Paris Conference in January 1920, attempted to address these problems and prevent another world war, but ultimately was unable to do so. The war brought about massive social upheaval as millions of women entered the workforce to replace men who went to war or never returned. This global conflict also facilitated the spread of one of the deadliest pandemics in history, the Spanish flu of 1918, which claimed an estimated 20 to 50 million lives. Often referred to as the First Modern War, World War I introduced many technologies now associated with military conflict. Machine guns, tanks, aerial combat, and radio communications were introduced on a massive scale during World War I. The devastating effects of chemical weapons such as mustard gas and phosphine on soldiers and civilians shocked the world, galvanizing public and military opposition to their use. These sentiments culminated in the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which restricted the use of chemical and biological agents in warfare, a restriction that remains in effect today. While the war left a profound legacy on society and geopolitics, its story is also marked by eerie coincidences that continue to fascinate historians and the public alike. In a haunting twist of fate, the car carrying Archduke Franz Ferdinand at his assassination bore the number plate A111118, eerily reminiscent of the date the war ended. Armistice, the 11th day, the 11th month of 1918. The first Battle of the Marne occurred in the war's opening year, while the second Battle of the Marne occurred in the end. The war itself lasted 4 years, a number often associated with completeness in biblical terms. The 100 Days Offensive, also a number meaning completeness. Another chilling coincidence, on the war's final day, British troops returned to Mons, the very site where they had fought their first battle. Forgive me, I just can't help noticing the unsettling parallels. Modern historians often argue that the Treaty of Versailles was more lenient than might have been expected and not inherently unfair. They contend that its failure to prevent another war stemmed more from unresolved fault lines in Europe than from the treaty itself. They suggest that the treaty might have succeeded if the Allied nations had enforced it effectively, rather than falling into disunity. Diverging national interests, disagreements over the severity of the peace terms, and conflicting views on managing the post-war order all undermined cohesion among the Allies. This lack of unity contributed to the treaty's weak enforcement and allowed tensions to fester. The Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh punishments on Germany, including crippling reparations, territorial losses, and severe restrictions on its military. While these measures aimed to weaken Germany, critics feared they might lay the groundwork for future unrest. A significant portion of the United States Congress, particularly in the Senate, believed that the Treaty of Versailles could sow the seeds of future conflict. Senator Philander Knox tells Wilson, "Mr. President, I am convinced after the most painstaking consideration that I can give, this treaty does not spell peace, but war. War more woeful and devastating than the one we have that now closed." Economist John Maynard Keynes echoed Knox's perspective. He opposed the treaty and foresaw the consequences of these punitive measures, warning that if we take the view that Germany must be kept impoverished and her children starved and crippled, vengeance, I dare say, will not limp.